The morning had been quiet until the sound of heavy footsteps broke the rhythm of my typing. When I looked up, Magnus Draven, our CEO, stood in the doorway of my cubicle, his jaw tight, eyes sharp as glass. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "Shut down your workstation and leave," he said flatly. For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. My workstation wasn't just a desk with a monitor. It was the sole terminal directly linked to Zenith Industries' live system, the feed that handled real-time product data and distribution signals for their upcoming launch. I kept my voice steady. "Do you mean log out of the monitoring software? Or a full shutdown?" I asked. His lips pressed into a thin line. "Full shutdown. Now." The words landed with the weight of a hammer. I repeated the question, more deliberate this time, to give him one last chance to reconsider. He snapped, "Don't play games. Shut it down." I had spent years building this connection from the ground up, engineering it to be airtight against breaches. Zenith trusted me with it because they knew how fragile success could be. And Magnus, in all his arrogance, wanted to treat it like any other desktop. Reasoning with him had never worked. He thrived on confrontation, not logic. I turned back to the screen and began the shutdown sequence. Warning prompts cascaded across the interface, disconnecting live stream, terminating processes, severing client data feed. Each confirmation click felt like cutting through months of careful preparation. The final line appeared, "System offline." I logged the action in the audit trail with precision. Client live feed terminated per CEO instruction at 10:59 a.m. I removed my badge from its lanyard and placed it neatly on the desk. Magnus smirked, as if victory were already his. "Leave. I'll take it from here." I rose slowly, my pulse calm though my thoughts raced. He had no idea what he had just triggered. The machine's quiet hum faded behind me as I walked toward the elevator, the weight of the inevitable already pressing in. Years earlier, when Zenith Industries first signed with us, they didn't ask for convenience, they demanded certainty. Their legal team came armed with checklists, auditors, and a security officer who grilled me for hours. Out of those negotiations came the feed I designed, a connection meant to be as close to unbreakable as a system could be. It wasn't plug and play. Every key, every handshake, every checkpoint was deliberate. If the line went down for any reason, it would take 48 to 72 hours of compliance approvals and revalidation to bring it back. That was the trade-off for absolute trust. Resilience against outsiders meant fragility if someone on the inside pulled the plug. Magnus Draven never understood that distinction. To him, I was hoarding power, protecting my little kingdom. He said it once during a board meeting, loud enough for me to hear. What he couldn't accept was that it wasn't about me, it was about the contract we had all signed, the rules Zenith demanded, the stakes that kept everyone's salaries paid. Cyril Montrose, our COO, had been the only one to back me fully. He was steady where Magnus was restless, pragmatic where Magnus was reckless. It was Cyril's insistence that only I touch the terminal. He told the board it wasn't politics, it was survival. Without those controls, a single careless keystroke could cost millions. That evening, back in my apartment, I set my bag down and sat by the window overlooking the Charles River. Boston's lights shimmered across the dark water. My father's words came back to me as if he were still sitting across the table. Systems don't fail. People do. Gareth Corrin had been an engineer all his life, practical and stubborn, the kind of man who measured twice and cut once. He taught me that structure wasn't a cage, it was protection against human arrogance. Magnus would never see it that way. To him, procedures were obstacles, not safeguards. And I knew eventually, sooner rather than later, that blindness would catch up with him. The following morning, I chose not to go straight to my desk but to sit in a cafe across the street, waiting for the fallout to show itself. I arrived at the cafe across from our office earlier than usual, but not to savor the coffee. My laptop stayed closed in my bag, untouched. I simply sat by the window, watching the glass tower across the street, knowing that silence never lasts long in a place like ours. The feed was already offline. By now, someone had noticed. Through the reflection of the morning crowd, I caught sight of Magnus striding out of the revolving doors. He carried himself like a man who had just seized control of a kingdom. His tie was loosened, his phone in one hand, a paper cup in the other. He even laughed at something on his screen, oblivious to the storm gathering just out of frame. The glass doors opened again, and this time it wasn't employees in line for lunch. Verena Calder, Zenith's representative, walked in, sharp navy suit cutting through the lobby light. At her side was Cyril Montrose, shoulders tight, his face set like stone. They didn't need to raise their voices. Urgency radiated from the pace of their steps. I leaned closer to the window, coffee cradled in both hands. Magnus spotted them too late. Verena stopped directly in his path, her phone raised, screen flashing red with alerts. Even from across the street, I could read the shape of her lips. Why is the system offline? Magnus froze mid-step, the smile falling off his face. His hand wobbled, and hot coffee splashed over the edge of the cup. The product launch was less than 2 hours away, and he had just realized the feed wasn't a lever he could pull at will. I took a slow sip, letting the bitterness settle on my tongue. He hadn't connected the dots yet, but I had. This wasn't the collapse. Not yet. It was only the first crack, and the dam behind it was heavy with pressure. Inside that building, voices would rise, emails would fly, and the countdown to disaster had already begun. And I was exactly where I wanted to be, close enough to witness every domino fall. By the time I stepped back into the building, the atmosphere had already shifted. Conversations cut short when I passed. Screens flickered with error codes, and the low hum of Slack notifications pulsed like static through the floor. Panic doesn't need words, it seeps into the air, heavy and unmistakable. 2 junior analysts were huddled near the printer, whispering with wide eyes. I caught fragments as I walked by. The client is furious. The feed won't reconnect. Not even a backup handshake works. Their voices were brittle with fear, like glass about to crack. At the far end of the hallway, Magnus was in full performance mode. His voice carried even through the glass walls of a conference room. This wasn't my decision. She did it deliberately to sabotage me. His gaze flicked toward me, sharp enough to draw blood. I didn't flinch. The audit log has the truth, I said evenly, projecting just enough for the words to slip into the silence. Across the aisle, Darian Holt, one of the sharper analysts, shifted uncomfortably. I knew he'd seen the messages. Magnus had bragged in the team chat only days ago, finally taking control of the feed. About time. Darian's eyes darted from me to Magnus, then down to his shoes, as if the weight of that memory burned in his mind. Magnus pressed on, pacing with hands spread wide, his tone slick with manufactured indignation. She always thought the system was hers, not the company's. This is the proof. But the cracks in his story showed. People were already looking at him differently. Too many witnesses, too many receipts. He had underestimated how loudly arrogance echoes when it's written down. I sat back at my desk, my hand steady on the keyboard. He thought he could bury his mistake beneath noise and accusation, but the rope he had tied around my name was already tightening around his own. The call for an emergency meeting pinged across my screen, summoning us all to conference room B. Conference room B was already half full when I stepped inside. The long table gleamed under the fluorescent lights, every chair pulled forward with clinical precision. Magnus sat at the head, posture rigid, pen tapping against the wood in a rhythm too quick to be casual. Across from him, Cyril Montrose leaned back, arms crossed, eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the glass wall. Selena Harrow, our HR director, arranged her notebook in neat lines, pen poised. Octavia Lorne, legal counsel, adjusted her glasses without looking up. Magnus broke the silence first, voice sharp enough to slice through the air. She never told me shutting down meant killing Zenith's feed. I slid a folder across the table. Paper whispered as it moved, landing squarely in front of him. Inside the audit trail with timestamps, Slack screenshots where he dismissed security concerns, confirmation prompts he insisted I follow. The record is clear, I said. At 11:04 a.m., the shutdown was executed per your order. Octavia's eyes flicked to me, steady and direct. Did you confirm twice? Yes, I said without hesitation. First at 11:02, asking if he wanted a full shutdown or just session logout. He answered full shutdown. Then again at 11:03, clarifying that it would terminate the live connection. His reply was, "Don't play games." The room tightened around those words. Silence stretched until even the hum of the air vents seemed too loud. Celine scribbled steadily in her notebook, not once glancing up. Cyril exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable, like stone weathered by years of storms. Magnus shifted in his chair, his confidence eroding in real time. "This is being exaggerated," he muttered, fumbling for control. But the cadence of his voice betrayed him. I sat with my hands folded, calm in the stillness. The evidence didn't need embellishment. It spoke for itself. When the meeting adjourned, Selena's notes were tucked away, Octavia's folder thick with documentation, and Cyril rose without a word. Magnus remained seated, staring at the table as if it might offer him an escape. Outside, the summons for a larger board session was already waiting in my inbox. By the afternoon, whispers had grown into open conversations. Phones lit up across the floor with snippets of Zenith's fury. Their legal team had sent a formal notice if the feed wasn't restored immediately. They would invoke penalty clauses and reserve the right to terminate the contract. $40 million in annual revenue balanced on a knife's edge. Magnus convened a quick call with several directors, his voice booming through the speaker system in the glass-walled conference room. "This is nothing more than a technical hiccup. We'll have it resolved by tomorrow." He smiled as he spoke, but his shoulders were stiff, the mask slipping. Across the table, Octavia Lorne opened a thick folder, her tone cool as ice. Hiccup. The penalty exposure alone runs into the tens of millions. If Zenith terminates for cause, it's not a bruise, it's a hemorrhage. She slid the figures across to the directors, each page marked with red ink. Cyril sat quietly, hands folded, observing more than speaking. When his gaze finally lifted, it met mine for a fraction of a second. He didn't nod, didn't smile, but the message was clear enough. They're watching you, not him. Magnus slammed his hand against the table, the sound echoing against glass. "This isn't on me." His voice cracked as it rose. "She's the one who shut it down. She created this fragile setup. If anyone's accountable, it's her. I didn't answer. I didn't need to." The audit log was already in circulation, passed hand to hand through leadership. Everyone knew the trail led back to him. His protests sounded less like defense and more like desperation. One by one, the directors closed their folders, their silence more damning than any accusation. The weight in the room shifted, imperceptible, but certain. Authority was no longer on his side. When the meeting adjourned, Magnus stormed out, jaw clenched, while Cyril lingered at the doorway, his eyes following me instead. By the time I returned to my desk, a calendar invite was waiting. Board Emergency Session, 7 EUZP. Attendance required. The notice for the board session gave me less than 2 hours to prepare. I didn't waste a second. I opened my personal drive, a folder I'd been quietly curating for months, knowing one day Magnus's recklessness would demand a reckoning. Inside were every ignored email, every flagged security memo, every Slack thread where he mocked compliance as gatekeeping. I compiled them into a single, ordered record. Dates lined up in neat progression, each dismissal stacked against the last. The picture was undeniable. I had warned him, repeatedly, and he had chosen to wave it all aside. A knock on the side of my cubicle pulled me from the screen. Darian Holt hovered there, shifting the weight of his laptop nervously. He leaned in and lowered his voice. "You should see this." On his screen was a system log showing Magnus had manually deleted 3 of my memos from the shared compliance folder. Thought it looked odd. Darian said quietly. Good thing I grabbed a screenshot before it vanished. I felt the steady calm of confirmation. Magnus thought erasing files would erase accountability. But I had my personal archive, and now Darian's find sealed it. When I handed the binder to Selene Harrow in the prep room, she adjusted her glasses and opened it without a word. Page after page. She scribbled notes in her clipped handwriting. Octavia Lorne joined her, flipping through with a lawyer's precision, occasionally raising her brows at the timestamps. Cyril Montrose watched in silence from the corner. When his eyes met mine, there was a subtle shift. For the first time in days, his expression softened, the faintest acknowledgement that he saw the truth lining up on my side. The murmur of the boardroom down the hall was growing louder, the cadence of raised voices and restless shuffling. Selene closed the binder. Octavia tucked her notes under her arm, and Cyril rose, straightening his jacket. Together, we walked toward the glass doors where the board waited, the weight of proof heavy in my hands. The boardroom was cold with anticipation, the kind of chill that comes when everyone knows a verdict is near. At the center of the table, the projector hummed to life, casting the audit trail across the wall in stark black and white. 1104A, client live feed terminated per CEO instruction. The words hung there like a blade suspended above the room. No commentary, no interpretation, just fact. Magnus leaned forward, his palms flat on the polished wood. This is being misrepresented. I was never told shutting down her workstation would sever Zenith's live feed. Had I known, I would never have authorized it. Cyril's voice broke the silence, calm but cutting. You were told twice. Magnus. She asked you explicitly. I was copied on the compliance warnings months ago. Magnus turned red, his jaw tightening. Those memos were exaggerated. She always made it sound catastrophic. Octavia adjusted her glasses, flipping to the page marked with her pen. The memos were clear, and the audit log is immutable. Under our own compliance policy, this qualifies as negligence. Selene closed her notebook with a soft thud, her tone flat. Effective immediately. You are placed on administrative leave pending formal review. Magnus shot up from his chair, voice cracking into fury. This is political. You're all making me the villain so the board can protect its own failures. This company was mine to lead. The double doors opened, and 2 members of security stepped inside. Magnus's protests ricocheted off the walls, but the weight of the evidence drowned them. His voice faded down the hallway as he was escorted out, leaving only the echo of his anger behind. I stayed seated, my breathing steady. There was no triumph in me, only the gravity of what had been lost and what still loomed ahead. The boardroom was quiet again, but it wasn't peace, it was the pause before the next battle. When the doors closed, Cyril turned toward me, his expression unreadable. "Now we deal with Zenith," he said, and the room shifted to the business of survival. After Magnus was escorted out, the board turned back to me. Cyril spoke first, his voice steady but firm. "You'll lead the recovery effort. We don't have the luxury of hesitation." I nodded once, already pulling Darian Holt into the fold. He looked nervous but determined, the glow of his monitor reflecting off his glasses as we worked through the night. Together, we rebuilt the handshake protocols, step by careful step. Every validation hash, every compliance checkpoint had to align perfectly, or Zenith servers would reject us again. 2 days later, I boarded the train to Manhattan with binders tucked under my arm. At Zenith's headquarters, glass towers rose like sentinels against the skyline. Inside, Verena Calder waited, her arms crossed, her expression hard enough to cut through steel. "You expect us to forgive this?" she asked before I could sit. "Your system humiliated us on the eve of our biggest launch. I didn't deny it. I understand," I said quietly. "But the safeguards you required worked as designed. They shut everything down rather than risk corruption. I built it that way because I've seen what happens when corners get cut." I hesitated, then added, "I used to work at a startup that lived or died on one launch day. I know exactly how much this matters." Her eyes narrowed, but something in her stance shifted. She leaned back slightly, weighing my words. "Then show me you can fix it." Back in Boston, we ran test after test, the hours blurred, meals forgotten, coffee cooling untouched. At the 48th hour, the first indicator on the secure console blinked green, then another and another, until the hum of the system returned like a steady heartbeat. I exhaled for what felt like the first time in days, the weight lifting just enough to stand straight again. When the confirmation message from Zenith landed in my inbox, Cyril read it over my shoulder. His expression didn't soften, but his silence was permission enough. The next morning, the board scheduled one final meeting to decide the future of Strathwell. The boardroom felt different when I walked in again. There was no tension humming in the air, no unspoken question hanging above the table. Instead, the directors sat with their folders closed, their gazes fixed on me as Cyril rose from his chair. "Effective today," he said, his tone calm but firm. "You are appointed Interim Director of Systems Reliability." His words carried no hesitation. They landed like a seal pressed into wax final, undeniable. Celine followed, her notebook neatly aligned with the edge of the table. "A retention bonus has also been approved." She added, "For carrying the recovery and for reminding us why process exists." Her eyes met mine for a fraction of a second. Acknowledgement without sentiment. Magnus's name was never spoken. His office blinds had been closed for days, and the silence from that corner of the floor was louder than any accusation. Rumors trickled in from the industry press. Another firm had courted him, but Zenith's collapse had already marked him. Whatever new title he might claim, his reputation was no longer intact. Later, standing in my new office, the city spread wide beyond the glass wall, Boston's skyline threaded with lights shimmering against the river. I thought of my father, Gareth, and the lessons he had pressed into me with every blueprint and late-night calculation systems. Don't fail. People do. He was right. The collapse had never been about faulty code or fragile servers. It was about arrogance, shortcuts, and the refusal to listen. I let my hand rest against the cool glass, watching headlights trace their way across the bridges. My reflection stared back, steadier than it had been in years. Revenge had never been my aim. Responsibility was. As the evening deepened, I breathed in the quiet. For the first time in a long time, it wasn't the silence of dismissal or erasure. It was the silence of standing firm, unshaken, exactly where I was meant to be.